Welcome to the Psychedelic Passage podcast. My name is Jimmy Wynn. I will be your host today. So great to be here with you all on the podcast where we try to talk about all things related to the psychedelic curious and I think ways that can potentially enrich and increase value in your relationship with psychedelics. So thank you for joining us here this week. We have a pretty interesting topic that has been coming up, I think, more frequently in my conversations with folks in the psychedelic space, and that is the concept around when to escalate psychedelic dosages, the safety considerations, concerns, best practices around that. And I'll start by just describing the dynamic that I think we see in the way that individuals engage with psychedelics here in our culture in the United States. Absent of this being ingrained in our cultural use over the past decades, we don't have a lot of pathways on having good support systems for engaging with psychedelics. It's not like, if I was curious about psychedelics in my early 20s, I could go to a relative or a loved one or somebody in my community who I knew was first. And so this whole kind of dynamic of finding a support individual, a guide, a facilitator, a trip sitter, it's a practice that's that obviously has a lot of history, but in our modern era, it's something that's might feel relatively new, something that's kind of popping up for individuals, especially if you're just starting out with psychedelics, which a lot of our listeners are. And so you're framing up into your first time with psychedelics. Let's say it's your first time, or you've committed a lot of, let's say, time, effort to vetting a facilitator. You've taken the time off of work. You've made a financial commitment. And so everything is gearing up towards this one experience or this one kind of focal point. And it can feel really natural for a psychedelic journeyer to be like, well, I want the full experience. If I'm going to spend all of this time and effort and this, preparation work and to digging into all of the parts of myself, well, I want to get the most out of this. And so dosage becomes a dynamic in that. Oftentimes, I think that individuals may be in the midst of their experience, and let's say they're feeling a certain type of way, whether that's euphoria and connected to all things, or whether that's them going through a potent process and navigating content. Let's say it's something challenging in their life and they know, okay, this is something that I want to dig into and go more into. It can be a really common dynamic for people to be like, okay, well, I think I should take more. I think I should go into a higher dosage, or I want to keep this experience and this feeling going. I want to sustain, this current thing that's happening right now. And I think that that's natural for folks to want to, A, make sure that their dosage is optimal, and then B, want to almost like get the max benefit or like squeeze the lemon for, all that it's worth, because of this dynamic of most of the time folks are engaging in psychedelics like more sporadically. This might be your one experience of your life, or this might be your one experience for the year, or so on and so forth. So I think that there can be an interesting dialogue to be had here. And I'll back up to say that this dynamic of wanting to engage more with psychedelic medicines also has a little bit to do with our relationship with medicines and substances in our society. I think it also has a little to do with, social conditioning, this idea of like more is better. We as a society really value and honor like peak experiences, big momentous, experiences. And I'll also, share that we just have this paradigm in our society where, if you are engaging in some type of medicine or substance or whatever, if it's not doing the thing that you're wanting it to do, then just take more and more and more and more and more. And we see that across a lot of different medications and substances. I think from the journeyer's perspective, to me, it makes a lot of sense. It has a lot of logic to it. that there would be, this natural tendency to want to escalate your psychedelic dosage. But there's a couple of nuances here that we'll be discussing in this episode. And my goals for this episode is to talk through a couple of personal anecdotes that I think might be helpful for folks. Talk about some considerations in maybe how to navigate this with, your service provider. And then also just kind of break it down across maybe different substances and what might actually be some drawbacks if you decide to go into higher dosages. And I think ultimately what I want to do is reframe the conversation around dosage and what a full experience is. And I'll share for myself personally that what you need dosage wise is so contextual at any given time. I know that there is this conversation, yes, around set and setting, but I also feel like that is a basic framework of what I call like container work, meaning that yours, to me, specifically if we're talking about psilocybin mushrooms, but I'd say the same with any serotonergic medications or and substances, and even dissociatives like ketamine. It's so dependent on what you have going on in your life, the content that you have in your life, your stress resilience, your personal preparation practices, leading up into all of this. And so, yes, I think set and setting is important, but I think what I want to share with folks is that I've seen individuals and myself have the full experience, full blown experiences, meaning a deep altered state and the ability to process and work towards your intentions off of 2 grams. Conversely, I've seen individuals who have approached that 8, 9, 10 gram range, and there's evidence of individuals going even higher, and them having very null effect at all. And my hunch is that we probably just don't have the full picture. I think that yes, there are things like Q tests, which we have a access to. This is like these are test kits that can help you find the quantitative amount of psilocybin within, mushrooms. Even with that, I just have a hunch that there's probably more to the picture. I don't know if it's, alkaloid profiles or different constituents within psilocybin containing mushrooms specifically that can modulate the high, that can affect your experience. I would guess that we probably need to do a lot more research to really pinpoint all of the factors and players that are, leading into this. But ultimately, the experience that you have is so dependent on you as an individual. And it's becoming more standard practice nowadays for, individuals to start off with like an initial dose, especially with psilocybin, and then have an opportunity to move into, let's say, like 1 to 2 booster doses. And I think that there is a lot of merit in good targeting of your dosage, meaning I'm constantly thinking about what is the minimum viable dosage that allows me to come into an altered state of consciousness where I feel like I am, really engaging with the psychedelic. Like it's a really present and potent enough of an experience for me. And then moving from there, I think that it's a different conversation about like optimizing or getting the most of it, because I think that there's so much emphasis on like heroic doses, which we did an episode on, or really trying to nail or get this like full experience, but at what cost, I think that there are times where higher dosages doesn't always equate to a more meaningful or a more potent experience. And so, there's a lot of factors at play here, of which I had mentioned before, this, desire that if you're going to engage in psychedelic substances, that you're going to want to get, the most out of it. But I really offer folks to think in broader terms, because if we're looking at the preparation and the integration processes being just as important, if not more important than the psychedelic experience, a part of this is you want to set yourself up in a good way to be able to take that experience, that altered state of consciousness, and then actually have it as workable content in your integration. A lot of times, if you take too high of a dose, you might actually impair your ability, to do that. So I think a couple of questions arise here. How do you plan for this, especially for folks who are first time psychedelic experiencers? I think really getting aligned with your facilitator or support provider beforehand is so, so, so vitally important. And having explicit conversations about not only your intentions, your sensitivity to just drugs and medications and substances in general, your current kind of state emotionally, mentally, spiritually, physically, that can really help to inform and have these super explicit conversations with your service provider around what a potential range of an initial dose might look like and what potential booster doses might look like with psilocybin. If you're doing other substances like MDMA or LSD, which are the two other kind of popular accessible psychedelics floating around, oftentimes you're not really redosing. Maybe MDMA you might redose, but the dosage range with that is so narrow that you want to make sure that you're really accurate there. And then ketamine, typically for folks who are using ketamine and like a off schedule use through, let's say, a ketamine clinic or something, usually those dosages are prescribed. So when we're talking about psilocybin, I think it's also important to get a sense of the facilitator's boundaries as well. Like, what is the maximum or minimum dosage that a facilitator works in? And why is that? What is the reason for that? And I think the more rapport and trust and honesty and transparency that you can build with the facilitator, myself, the more trust and transparency and honesty that I'm building with the client, the more I'm inclined to, explore potentially higher dosages. But again, this is about finding your target dosage, your minimum viable dosage, because it's not about ramping up into more and more and more dosages or more and more quantity if you're engaging with psilocybin mushrooms. I think the number one reason for me is that higher dosages can sometimes equate to just more active experiences, larger experiences, more expressive experiences, experiences that I'll say sometimes even the most adept and equipped facilitator might have some challenge in navigating, might be very challenging for, you to navigate. I think that psychedelics already, it's a pretty exhausting experience. What Nick always says is you're doing like mental and spiritual gymnastics for like 4 to 6 hours. And a lot of folks who come out of a psychedelic experience report that it feels like they just ran a 10K or, when all that they were doing was most of the time being horizontal on the couch or on a bed or somewhere. I think the second reason why folks should be, thoughtful about escalating a psychedelic dosage with psilocybin doses specifically is that oftentimes this can lead to more states of dissociation, and so with that can sometimes lead to this lack of ability to recall the events of the experience. That to me is probably the most impactful factor in somebody's integration process, is the ability to remember or recall not just the linear sequence of events, but the emotions and the feelings that were associated with content. Or, it's not just about the visualizations or the audiovisual, hallucinations. It's also about the content that comes with that, or any potential internal dialogue or internal conversations that come with that, internal reflections that come with that. And I often find that at higher dosages, I think that there's just this relationship, this correlation, that it can become more and more challenging and difficult to recall. I personally have been in my own experiences where I knew that it felt so profound, so valuable. I was like, in the moment, I was like, man, I really gotta encapsulate this and like take it with me. But it's really hard to write things down. It's really hard to document things while you're going through a psychedelic experience. And I would, in the afterglow or afterwards, I'd be like, I lost it. I forgot that thing, or I forget what that content was. And I can't help but just anecdotally say that I think that at higher dosages, it can become actually really difficult to have this process of recall and remembering and processing the experience, afterwards. Obviously, a caveat, it depends. It really, really depends on the individual. Like, I think that the sweet spot, right dosage for a person can be, 2 grams, 4 grams, 6 grams, or, even higher. Now, how do you talk about what the initial dosage and the booster dosages should look like? I think also I would add into this is that there are some ethical considerations to be had here. The moment that you are consuming the substance or communing with the psychedelic medicine and you've ingested that or you've taken that drug, you now no longer can really give clean and sober consent around dosage. And so I think that there's this balancing act of having your autonomy, having your sovereignty in the experience, trusting your intuition, knowing when to seek more medicine and knowing when to be where you're at, right? That's one bucket. And on the other side, it's like maybe you're not equipped to make those decisions when you are actually in the altered state. And so, I always suggest just having these conversations beforehand. I know that for some clients, it's also a helpful like peace of mind for them to feel like, okay, I'm starting with this initial dose, and then I'm remembering in my mind, I have kind of this opportunity for, let's say, 2 booster doses at these specific increments, and then we go from there. And I think it just depends on the consent of the facilitator as well. Like, sometimes a booster dose may not increase the, let's say, the potency of the experience, but also may increase the duration. So is your facilitator service provider, is it a part of your agreement that they're going to be there, with you for that extra or extended, period of time? And so, yeah, these are just ideas and conversations, for you to have. I think that I'll also name that there are just some power dynamics that come into play here. A lot of times there are clients who take the mentality of like, well, I'm finding a professional. I have a facilitator. I've engaged with the facilitator. I trust them to make the call on dosage. I think that it's really important to consult with the professional, of course, but also when you rest your entire decision making capabilities into the hands of a facilitator, I think that that requires you to give them as much information as you can first and foremost so that they're, using all of the parameters to make a decision. But I also think that it's important in the philosophy of, holistic psychedelic work, which is like this is about the relationship of between you and the psychedelic substance. And so there is, I think, a power in you at least having input or having a real heavy participation in determining what dosage is right for you. Oftentimes, and this is probably subjective and is really, really hard for somebody to describe in like scientific terms, but oftentimes there's like an intuitive process here where I think that individuals kind of can sense a range of dosage, for them. And then having those conversations openly with your facilitator, with all of your context and history available in the conversation to talk about. I think that that's a really good approach as far as trying to, nail down a dosage. I think as a facilitator, I always err on the side of being a little bit more conservative with dosage, and then knowing that you can always increase dosage. And I would much rather, this is just me personally, I would much rather spend more time with a client and make sure that we're incrementing, titrating up to the right dosage then have the risk of like overshooting that dosage, which may create a challenging, difficult, hard to navigate dynamic, for your client, or the possibility of them actually being in that sweet spot already, but then they have a desire, and then, the client is like asking for more medicine. And then that actually alters their experience in a less than favorable way. And so these are just good things to consider in having those conversations. And so I want to take this next moment and just break down, I think, from a journeyer's perspective, some of the potential drawbacks of going into, higher dosages. And I've already, covered some of, my thoughts regarding psilocybin, but we'll also just check in real quick with LSD, MDMA, and ketamine, because those seem to be the most prevalent in conversation, I think, with psychedelics recently. Again, with psilocybin, I think that at higher dosages, there can be this dynamic of having potentially larger, more active experiences. The possibility of, I think jumping into more like dissociative states. And even if you're not, hopping into dissociative states, I think that higher dosages often lead to less of an ability to recall the experience and the content that came up. I think also some things to consider with psilocybin is that there is kind of this diminishing returns at booster doses further down the road. So I find that, let's say, a booster dose in hour 3 is, I think, just a little bit less effective than the initial dose or booster dose within that, 60 to 90 minutes. As it falls to LSD, I think LSD, first and foremost, is a very, very, very minute measurement. We're talking about micrograms here, with standard, microgram dosages probably circling somewhere around 100 to 125 micrograms. I think folks could argue up or down, with that. What I find with LSD is that it is a long, long, long experience anyways. It's because of the specific way that the molecule binds with the serotonin receptors. So we're already talking about 8 to 10-hour experiences. Most of the time I don't see individuals like redosing with LSD exactly for that reason, meaning like you're going to be approaching 12, 14, 16, 18 hours. And that's just a marathon for anybody. I don't care how experienced you are with psychedelics. I think that there is a lot of like, mental considerations, because a lot of times with folks, if they're getting into, let's say, an LSD experience, they might feel a certain way, let's say 4 to 6 hours in, and they really, really want to sustain that. They're like, oh, this is amazing. I'm having a lot of processing. I'm having the experience that I want. So I want to keep that going. Well, by the time you hit hour 14 or hour 16, it can become quite a mental resilience challenge when you are ready for some rest. You are ready for the experience to start to taper down, but the experience is still largely and widely, going. I also think that it just depends on the form and format that folks are consuming, LSD. If you're getting, let's say, the substance on a tab of blotter paper or a gel tab or something like that, it's really hard to actually quantify dosage there. Even if you were able to get LSD in liquid form, still generally hard to quantify, because you're probably trusting the source on the titration or the concentration, of that. I think also there's a lot of folks who report just like a headache post LSD experience, and that's from an anecdotal standpoint, but I find that true for myself. So, I really wouldn't consider redosing or escalating dosages, with LSD, mostly because it's hard to pinpoint dosage anyways. And then just that long, long, long duration effect, which can cause some duress, down the road. With MDMA, as we've already mentioned, I think in past episodes, is that to me, this one takes the most load on your body, meaning it probably affects your physical body, your mental body, your emotion self, quite a bit. There's folks who talk about like the MDMA crash. Just uses so much serotonin in your system that for me, I often feel pretty depleted after these experiences. Also, a pretty small window, I think, of dosage. And so I think that in a therapeutic setting, it's not, I don't find it very common for individuals to be redosing on MDMA. Maybe it's a conversation that you have, with your facilitator. But when we're talking about, increments in milligrams, there can be a certain threshold to avoid potential just like physical side effects. Usually this is in the case of like jitters or tremors in the body, jaw clenching, which can, be have a lot of pressure on your head and your jaw. That's often called bruxism, or eye jiggle, which is where your eye is having this like kind of frequent, vibration. All of these are temporary, by the way. The eye jiggle is called nystagmus, but these are things to avoid, especially, with MDMA, knowing that it already has, a significant tax on your body. And I think that with MDMA, there can be a propensity or a desire to, especially if you're feeling euphoric feelings or that like entactogen type feeling, that connectedness to others, you may have a desire of wanting to do more and more and more and more. But there certainly is a caution that I preach, to folks, just knowing that MDMA can really wear down the body. So you got to take care of yourself there. I think with ketamine, as I mentioned, most of folks, unless in a recreational setting, are engaging with ketamine in some type of a clinical setting, whether you're doing an at home program where you're doing sublinguals or oral lozenges, those are usually lower dosages. At higher dosages, you're usually going into the clinic, whether that's an intramuscular injection or intravenous or something like that. So those dosages are generally dependent upon the protocols of those clinics and facilities. The one thing that I'll say is that ketamine can be habit forming. And I want to be very honest with the community and with our listeners here, where I think that, ketamine has massive, massive therapeutic potential and effect. I think that ketamine is often a bridge to altered states of consciousness and other, psychedelic use. I often find a lot of folks interweaving ketamine use with, let's say, psilocybin ceremony work or other, psychedelic work. I find a lot of folks are going back in for ketamine treatment somewhat, on a frequency of every month. I think that's high frequency to every couple of months to, once a quarter. So the one thing that I'll share is that ketamine does have this potential for not only becoming habit forming, but having a higher and higher tolerance as you move through more and more ketamine experiences. And so I want to particularly be mindful for individuals who might have a past substance use issue, substance use disorder. Maybe you just know in your personality that you have a little bit of an addictive, tendency, and so certainly want to share that and add that as a part of the conversation. And so I feel like I've kind of rambled on for the past 30 something or so minutes, but, there's a lot to talk about within this, topic. And I do hope that this conversation has illuminated some ideas, some questions, some thoughts for you as you are really considering in the moment what's right for me as far as escalating dosage. If I'm feeling this desire to do more and to take more medicine, I really invite people to pause and be like, huh, why is that? What part of me is that coming from? What is my motivation for wanting to do more? And I really want to reframe the conversation around dosage, that more is not always better. I think it's more important to have an accurate dosage than it is to have a higher quantity of dosage, particularly for psilocybin containing mushrooms. So that wraps up our episode this week. I also just want to take a moment to share some testimonials from our community. This one reads, my facilitator is absolutely the most incredible guide. His calm nature and intuitive conversations brought out deep things within me to light. My facilitator helped me to set my intention and gently probed me to ensure that we address deep issues of concern. I believe he was the primary reason, along with the medicine, of course, that enabled me to deal with issues that were the cause of my depression and PTSD. I feel genuinely renewed and happier as a result of my experience. And I'm probably going to butcher this, but they end it with mahalo, make, aloha. I think that that's really touching for me to know that there are folks out there getting this meaningful support. I think that I've said it before in past episodes, but the ability to be supported and witnessed and in community through these experiences makes so much difference. So thank you to that individual who sent in those kind words. Thank you to our listeners. I hope that you all have a wonderful rest of your week. You can find our podcast anywhere you search for podcasts. Primarily, we are on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Really grateful. I hope that anybody who listens to these episodes gets one grain, one kernel, one piece of valuable, insight or information. And we look forward to connecting with you next week.